Hello, welcome to Financial Insider Weekly. I'm your host, Michael Gray, CPA. My guest today is Martin Shanebaum, and Martin is an attorney specializing in civil and criminal tax litigation. His law firm, Martin A. Shanebaum, a professional law corporation, has been serving the national and international community in civil and criminal tax-related matters for over 30 years. Martin was formerly Assistant United States Attorney in the Northern District of California Tax Division, and formerly an IRS Regional Counsel trial attorney. Mr. Shanebaum and his team of professionals prevent civil tax controversies from becoming criminal matters and battle the government for individual clients, corporations, and other business entities. Today, I've asked Martin to provide some guidance about dealing with IRS collection issues. In other words, I owe back taxes, now what? Now, this is the third of a series of 3 interviews that I've done with Martin. We also covered IRS audits and appeals and tax court. And so you can find those interviews at our website, financialinsiderweekly.com, under past episodes. Now, as we talk about this matter of owing back taxes, we're going to be covering highlights of a complex subject. So this is the beginning of a conversation that you should be having with a qualified tax advisor about your situation. Martin, thank you again for joining me today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, great. Now, when you don't have the money to pay your taxes, does that mean you're a bad person?
No, in today's world, in today's economy, I mean, that may be more than the norm, that people do not have the money for back taxes. And that is, just recently the Federal Reserve raised the rate. Up to now, they were hedging on it because they know that the economy is shaky. Mm-hmm. So IRS is sensitive to this. I mean, I guess we'll talk about that they have varied the new collection procedures, especially with offers and compromise. But no, you're not a bad person. You just need to be wise in how you approach taking care of the back taxes.
Okay. Do you deal with the same people at the IRS for these, what we call collections here, as opposed to a tax audit?
No. The IRS has several divisions. There's the audit or examination division, there's the criminal division, and then there's the collection division. And so the collection's a completely different aspect. Collections come after the IRS has a valid assessment, either by consent or by legal decree. Now, when you deal with collection, you're dealing with a revenue officer. Collection is a different aspect of tax practice. Mm-hmm. The government, I like to think, has raw primitive power in collection. That's the judges and courts have said that's the lifeblood of the country, collecting the taxes. Mm-hmm. So they have a lot of tough procedures and power to take property, assets, levy, unlike the other divisions where you have a whole lot of time to go through various procedures. Mm-hmm. I mean, even in the criminal case, you can't just have a criminal result without going through a lot of procedures and exercising your Fifth Amendment rights, your Fourth Amendment rights, and other constitutional rights. Or in a civil procedure, you have a lot of rights like appeals, go to the tax court, go to the district court. When you go to collection, you have very restricted rights because the government needs the lifeblood, that is the tax revenue.
In other words, the government has to be able to pay its bills, and so if they need, it's just like if you're running a business. If your clients don't pay their bills, you don't have the money. You don't have money to pay your own vendors.
Right.
Okay. So maybe you can explain to us briefly about how this collection process works.
Well, first of all, you get a notice of intent to levy, or a notice of intent to put a lien on. Just recently, when I say the last maybe 10 years, there's a new procedure called collection due process appeals. So when you get a notice of intent to levy or a notice of intent to lien, you have, let's say, 30 days to appeal under the collection due process.
Okay. So when you get one of these letters, is this a letter that you want to just sort of put aside and I'll take care of that later?
No, you want to jump on this immediately. The key, as we discussed in the other interviews with the IRS, is communication. One of the biggest problems that taxpayers have, and that I've seen in my practice, is they show up either after the deadline is passed or on the day of the deadline. You immediately want to look at that notice and take action, because that can really change your lifestyle. Because if you don't do something, you could end up losing assets, being foreclosed on a house, and you don't want that. You want to communicate. The key to IRS matters is communication with the representative of the IRS.
Okay. What are the consequences for a late tax payment?
Late tax payment will end up with a penalty for failure to pay, and interest, and also some notices about seizing of assets. So you want to take care of the payment as quickly as possible to avoid the failure to pay penalty and the additional interest.
Okay. What are some alternatives to paying the tax in full?
Well, first of all, let me just say that the government has some kind of payment plan, installment payment, or offer in compromise. Not a good procedure. What you want to do is find, if you can, alternative financing and pay the tax as soon as possible in full. Because if you go into what the IRS may offer, an installment plan, which is usually no more than 5 years, you find that any payment creates a collapse of the plan and everything's due immediately. You could also go into bankruptcy, which I don't think you want to do. And you could also end up in an offer in compromise. But that is a really difficult procedure. It's convoluted. The government is begrudgingly giving you this offer in compromise. If you end up with the offer in compromise and you are successful, you don't owe any more tax. I mean, you're done. But to get one of those is like, will it snow in July in San Francisco? It's tough. I mean, even though they've revamped the procedures, and what they really want from you under that kind of procedure is your equity, any assets, any monthly payment, extra monthly excess payment times around 48 months. So what you're talking about is a convoluted formula that will really put a crimp on your lifestyle, and so you need to try to get alternative financing to pay the tax in full. The message here is try to get the tax paid in full as quickly as possible, together with try to reduce the amount as owed by saying doubt as to collectability, doubt as to liability. This is why you need a professional to handle this matter, because if you try it on your own, you probably most likely be unsuccessful. Even the professionals, in a great measure of time, are not successful in large measure.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing, I think all of us have seen this. There are law firms that are fishing for business, basically offering compromise and selling it as an IRS program. They don't call it offering compromise; they call it some other fancy name or whatever. But they make it sound like it's a slam dunk, So, do you have any comments related to that?
Yes, I think you're very astute. I mean, in my career, I've seen a lot of clients who've come over from the so-called law firms or accounting firms or tax firms that say, we can reduce your $10,000 liability to the IRS to $1,000. I mean, it may happen occasionally, but most of the time what happens is you pay a substantial fee and the results are inadequate.
They're more problematic, maybe we should say.
Right. I mean, the two key concepts that everyone should keep in mind: doubt as to collectability and doubt as to liability. If you push that through competent representation, you will get a reduction in the tax. I mean, you also have things like a health problem, economic hardship. All of those factors will work with the IRS if you communicate properly through proper representation.
Okay. So what amounts due to the IRS are dischargeable in bankruptcy?
Taxes that are owed 3 years prior to the bankruptcy. What is not dischargeable and is the trust fund liability. Now, what is the trust fund liability? That's just a catchphrase. Trust fund liability is if you're an employer and you're paying your workers a salary, you have two items. You pay a tax on the employer, but you also withhold from the salary, and that goes into what you call the trust fund. That is not dischargeable. So my recommendation, if you get in that situation, try to pay whatever you're paying towards the trust fund liability, because the other liability could be dischargeable in bankruptcy.
Right. Now, related to this, now they have these electronic payment, that's basically is required for employers now. But if you have this situation, I wouldn't think that you would want to be doing that, because then they're just going to apply it where they want to apply it. Isn't that right?
Right. Well, so you have to designate, and sometimes there's a big battle that they don't want to accept your designation, but you have to force the designation.
That's why I'm saying that I don't think you want to do it electronically in that case. You probably want to pay it maybe with a check or something, and you say, this payment is for my trust fund taxes.
Right. In fact, the technique that you want to do is you want to ask for a revenue officer to be assigned to the case. And so you have a person that you're dealing with, and you can designate how you want to go with the payment. And if you have a revenue officer who will work with you, you'll get a better result. You don't want to do it electronically, as you well stated.
Yeah, okay. How can you get an installment agreement?
With great difficulty.
Oh?
But you can get an installment agreement working with the revenue officer and presenting a fair, reasonable payment plan. But there's dangers with the installment, because you miss an installment, the whole thing collapses. So you need to make sure that if you have the installment, that you fulfill the terms of the installment agreement, dot the I, cross the T. If you don't do that, it's going to collapse. That's why it's better to look for alternative financing and pay it in full.
So, you have more experience with these probably even than I do. Are they doing anything now? It seems like in many cases we're seeing these auto pay type programs that are happening, like for paying your mortgage and paying for your utility bills and so forth. Can you set up like an auto pay for this installment agreement? Or have you seen it?
Yes, but the problem here is, again, the key to success is to get someone assigned to your case, a revenue officer and pay that person, because I've seen where the auto payment plans get out of whack. Either sometimes the IRS computer, which is not perfect, screws up the auto pay, or sometimes you don't have sufficient funds in the bank for the auto pay. Either one of these triggers a collapse of the installment agreement.
Wow. Okay. Is there a statute of limitations for unpaid income taxes?
Yeah, it's 10 years and it can be extended. So you want to. A lot of people are amazed that they are on the hook for 10 years. You know why they're amazed? Because let's say you owe $10. In 5 years, that's $20. In 10 years, that's $30. I'm just giving you an example.
Yeah.
So the interest accrues daily.
Right, and it adds on penalties and so forth, and it's all compounding.
Right. So what happens is you get a huge bill involving interest and penalties plus the tax.
Right. Now, what if you never even filed an income tax return?
Well, what about that?
Well, as I understand it, there is no statute of limitations if you haven't filed a tax
That's
return.
correct. There's no statute of limitation.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about offer and compromise. So maybe you can explain a little bit about what it is and how the rules have changed a little bit in the recent years.
Well, the offer and compromise is you're saying that I owe $10,000. Let's take that as an example. I offer $3,000. The government comes back and says, no, we want $5,000. If you agree, let's say you go back and say, I can't do $5,000. How about we compromise in $4,000? And the compromise they accept. They say we want 20% down, and that's non-refundable. So if the whole thing collapses, it's non-refundable. But the interesting thing recently, the IRS changed the rule because in the past they could sit on it and you never hear from them. But if they sit on it for 2 years, it's deemed to be accepted. The problem is the IRS, if it's on top of the game, right near the end of the 2-year period, will say, okay, we accept or we don't accept. So now, if you're sitting around for 2 years, the interest is accruing, and if it's not accepted, you lost the 20% deposit that you put down, plus one other item, the application fee. I'm not a big fan of the offer and compromise. So I'm a bigger fan as a technique to go talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to the bank, try to get some financing and pay it off so that you get the IRS. You don't want the IRS as your partner.
Yeah, personally, I haven't had a whole lot of luck getting offers accepted. Found it a very frustrating process. But again, the ones that I was handling was before they came out with some of these new rules. I think one of the things interesting, though, you did mention the thing as to doubt as to liability. And so in many cases, you may be beyond like what we would think of as the 3-year statute of limitations when you could usually do an amended return. But if you haven't paid the tax, you could do it by way of an offer and compromise, and still possibly have that liability adjusted because of a matter that a correction on the tax return.
Well, if you're going to do an offer and compromise, is the preliminary negotiations as to what the liability will be, and that's where you have to press doubt as to liability or doubt as to collectability. What happens is, however, you have to turn over a lot of financial information and a lot of financial statements, and perhaps the taxpayer doesn't want to do that because you've exposed all your finances, and if the offer and compromise collapses, then you have the revenue officer going out there and levying on assets or leaning assets and then levying. So and plus the statute of limitations gets suspended while the offer and compromise is pending.
Right.
So there's a lot of downside to that. Again, I reiterate, my belief is you want to go out there and mind the family, the friends, your business associates, and try to pay it in full. When I say in full, if you've negotiated the tax down because of doubt as to liability or doubt as to collectability, and let's say you took the $10,000 example and got it down to $3,000, and you can muster the money for $3,000, you're better off paying it, even though you might be paying elsewhere to relatives, family, or other financial institutions.
So I think part of what you're saying is, let's say you're successful with an offer, you don't really want to hook a payment plan into it. You want to, okay, we've got a figure here, and then just come up with the money to pay the figure.
Correct. You don't want the IRS as your partner, because anything that goes wrong collapses the agreement, and then you're subject to collection activities such as seizing assets, foreclosing on your house, which is a big problem because the IRS doesn't like to do that, but they will if necessary.
So it sounds like you haven't done a whole lot of offers yourself. Is that right? Or
that's correct.
For the most part, you discourage clients from taking that approach.
The offers that I have done have taken long time, and they're very frustrating. And sometimes in the past, what they've done has been unreasonable because of the formula. I mean, people are just desperate to survive, and they will impose, we want the assets, we want the monthly income, we want this, we want that, and leave the taxpayer with very little to live on. So I'd rather be more flexible and try to pay it in full and not get trapped into what the offer and compromise. As you pointed out, it's very difficult, and to me, I found it in the past frustrating, although I've had several to be successful. I have a lot that were not successful, and it consumes a lot of time. But the emotional damage to the taxpayer is great. Remember, taxes are not in vacuum. People have emotions, they have hardships, they have psychology of it. So in looking at the big picture, psychologically, I don't think an offer and compromise is really that good if you have a skillful representative can maneuver around it and achieve almost the same result by skillful advocacy.
Now, one of the things that you mentioned that I think I want to highlight again, because both this offer and compromise and when you're setting up most formal payment plans requires a lot of disclosure to the IRS. Yes. that actually may put you in a bad position if things don't work out.
Correct. And a lot of times taxpayers have tried to, what they call, be creative with the financial information. And the IRS currently has a program where they're referring collection fraud to IRS criminal.
Oh, wonderful.
So you could end up, instead of having a collection case, you can end up in a criminal case, and a lot of taxpayers feel the pressure that they need to save something. They don't want to lose everything. So for that reason, you also don't want to engage in activity where you can, go to your friends, go to the business, go to financial, get the money and pay it in full.
Yeah. We just have a couple minutes left, so I have to let you know that because I'm going to ask you sort of a loaded question, but maybe you can answer it briefly. What do you do when an IRS agent shows up to your door and says, I'm a revenue officer and I'm here to collect the tax that you owe the IRS?
Well, first of all, let me just go on record to say there's a big scam going on. People call up and say, we're an IRS revenue officer, and if you don't pay X, we're going to come and arrest you. This is a scam. IRS will never do that. IRS has proper procedures. But if an IRS revenue officer shows up and says you owe the tax, you have a lot of procedures. Okay, I want to appeal your discussion here and of saying that I owe additional tax and that you want it immediately because you have collection due hardships. You have a collection appeal process. But what I'm saying at the bottom line is you don't want to handle this yourself. You want to get a proper representation, get someone like yourself who's a sophisticated CPA, or get somebody like myself that has handled IRS matters over a considerable period of time. Do not try to do it on your own and just tell the IRS revenue officer, thank you, I'll have my representative be in touch with you, take that person's card and follow through.
Right. So I guess what we're getting down is this is a case where you may not want to just cooperate and cave, because, well, one, you want to make sure that this is legitimate. And so
certainly
you need to get your legal representation.
Certainly, and especially with the collection, because I said at the beginning, the collection activity is the raw primitive power of the IRS.
Okay. Folks, we're all out of time. Thanks for joining us. See you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.